Picture the Sahara Desert. Close your eyes for a second and really see it. Endless waves of sand dunes stretching to the horizon. Temperatures that hit 136 degrees Fahrenheit. No water, no trees, barely any life at all. Just 6 million square miles of nothing. It's the largest hot desert on Earth, roughly the size of the entire United States. If you were dropped in the middle of it without supplies, you'd be dead in 3 days, maybe 2. Now, before we go any further, do me a favour. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. Seriously, I read these and it's wild. Tokyo at sunrise, London at lunch, somebody in Sao Paulo trying to fall asleep at 3 a.m. All of us here together, about to travel back in time. Here's what's going to blow your mind. What if I told you that 10,000 years ago the Sahara wasn't a desert at all? What if it was green? Not just a little green around the edges, completely green. Rivers flowing year-round, lakes the size of England, hippopotamuses wallowing in watering holes, elephants, giraffes, crocodiles. Stone Age humans living in permanent settlements, fishing, hunting, creating art on cave walls that we can still see today. Sounds impossible, right? Like some fantasy world from a movie. But it's not fantasy. It's history. Real, documented, scientifically proven history. The Sahara Desert was once paradise. And this isn't ancient speculation. We have the evidence. Satellite imaging can detect ancient river systems buried under the sand. Archaeologists have found Stone Age tools, pottery, even human skeletons in places that haven't seen rain in thousands of years. Climate scientists have drilled into lake beds that are now bone dry and pulled up layers of sediment filled with pollen from trees and grasses. The proof is everywhere once you know where to look. But here's where it gets really interesting. The Sahara didn't just turn green once. It's happened over and over again throughout history. Every 20,000 years or so, like clockwork, the desert transforms into grassland. Rivers appear, lakes fill up, life explodes across the landscape. Then, just as dramatically, it all disappears again. The rivers dry up, the lakes evaporate, the grasslands turn back to sand. Everything living there either adapts, migrates, or dies. Scientists call this the African humid period cycle. But there's another name for it, one that captures what it really means for human history, the Sahara Pump. Think of it like a giant environmental pump that's been switching on and off for hundreds of thousands of years. When it switches on, the Sahara becomes habitable, paradise even. Humans and animals flood in from surrounding areas, populations explode, cultures develop. Then the pump switches off, the desert returns, and all those humans and animals have to go somewhere. They get pushed out, pumped out, forced to migrate north into Europe and the Middle East, into Asia, even potentially contributing to migrations that eventually reach the Americas. This isn't just some interesting climate trivia. This is the story of how humanity left Africa. This might be the mechanism that explains why modern humans exist on every continent, why your ancestors, wherever you're from, ended up where they did. This Sahara Pump didn't just move populations around. It may have shaped the entire course of human evolution and history. See, for most of the time humans have existed, we stayed in Africa. That's where we evolved. That's where we belonged. But something changed around 100,000 years ago, and then again more successfully around 60,000 years ago. Groups of humans started leaving Africa, moving into territories their ancestors had never explored. Why? What made them leave the homeland after hundreds of thousands of years? Climate change. But not the gradual kind. The dramatic, landscape-transforming, civilization-ending kind. the kind that turns paradise into hell and forces you to choose between migration and death. The story we're about to explore stretches from 10,000 years ago to the present day. We're going to witness the last great greening of the Sahara, see how humans lived in this lost world, understand the climate mechanics that made it all possible. Then we'll watch it die. We'll follow the desperate migrations as the desert reclaimed the land. We'll see how this pump mechanism worked not just once, but dozens of times over hundreds of thousands of years, each time reshaping human populations and pushing our ancestors into new territories. And here's something that'll keep you thinking. The Sahara Pump isn't finished. It's just in its off phase right now. In another 15,000 years or so, the climate cycles will shift again. The rains will return. The desert will bloom. The pump will switch back on. But this time, there are 8 billion humans on this planet. What happens when the Sahara turns green again and we're all still here? That's where we're headed. But first we need to go back. Back to when the sand was grass, when the dunes were lakes, when the Sahara was the richest, most life-filled place on Earth. Back to a world that existed not in some distant geological epoch, but within the memory of human civilization. A world that people lived in, thrived in, and then lost forever when the pumps switched off and paradise turned to dust. This is the story of the Green Sahara, and it's the story of us. But let me tell you about something that seems impossible, something that sounds like science fiction but is absolutely verifiably real. There was a time, not that long ago in geological terms, when the Sahara Desert, that vast expanse of sand and rock that dominates North Africa, was green. Not just a little green around the edges, not just scattered oases in an otherwise barren landscape. I mean genuinely, completely, impossibly green. Rivers everywhere, lakes the size of small seas, grasslands stretching to the horizon, forests thick enough to get lost in. This was the African humid period, and it lasted from roughly 15,000 years ago to about 5,000 years ago. 10,000 years of paradise right where you'd least expect it. Now, when I say the Sahara was green, I'm not talking about some subtle ecological difference that you'd need scientific instruments to detect. I'm talking about a transformation so complete that if you could somehow transport yourself back there, you wouldn't recognize the place at all. Where there's now nothing but sand dunes for hundreds of miles, there were rivers. Not seasonal streams that dried up most of the year, but permanent substantial rivers with multiple tributaries, deep channels and year-round flow. Archaeological evidence shows these ancient river systems were massive. We're talking waterways that would rival modern rivers in terms of volume and ecological importance. The crown jewel of this lost world was Mega Lake Chad. Today, Lake Chad is a shallow, shrinking body of water that's barely a fraction of its former extent. It's maybe 1,500 square kilometers on a good year, and it's getting smaller. But during the African humid period, Lake Chad covered over 400,000 square kilometers. That's roughly the size of the Caspian Sea, which is the largest lake on Earth today. Imagine that. A body of water the size of California, sitting in the middle of what is now the Sahara Desert. It had permanent shorelines with beaches. It had harbours where people built fishing communities. It had islands large enough to support their own ecosystems. Sediment cores from the ancient lake bed show it was up to 180 metres deep in some places. That's deep enough for substantial fish populations, complex aquatic ecosystems, and enough water to influence the regional climate for hundreds of miles in every direction. But Mega Lake Chad wasn't alone. the entire Saharan region was dotted with interconnected lakes and wetlands. There was a massive lake system in what's now southern Libya. Another major lake filled the Baudelaire Depression, a region that's now one of the driest, dustiest places on Earth. Satellite imaging, which can detect ancient drainage patterns beneath the sand, has revealed an incredible network of paleo lakes, ancient bodies of water that once connected across the entire Saharan region. Some researchers estimate there were hundreds of substantial lakes, maybe thousands of smaller ones, creating a mosaic of aquatic environments across North Africa. The rivers that fed these lakes came from multiple sources. The Nile was there, of course, but it was bigger, broader, with a much larger floodplain than today. There were also massive river systems flowing from the central Saharan highlands. These weren't hypothetical rivers that we're guessing about. We can see them. Satellite radar has penetrated beneath the sand to reveal ancient river channels, some of them hundreds of miles long, carving paths through what is now absolutely barren desert. One ancient river system in Mauritania was so large that researchers have nicknamed it the Tamanrasset River. During the humid period, it drained a massive watershed from the central Sahara all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Today, there's nothing there but sand, not a drop of water, but beneath the surface the ancient channels are still there, preserved like fossils, proof that water once flowed in abundance where nothing flows now. The vegetation that grew around these rivers and lakes was remarkable. This wasn't desert scrubland barely clinging to life around scattered water sources. This was genuine, lush, productive vegetation. Pollen cores drilled from ancient lake beds show Mediterranean-style plant communities. Oak trees, cedar trees, olive trees growing in regions that now see rainfall maybe once every 5 years. The northern Sahara, particularly the Atlas Mountain foothills and the areas near the Mediterranean coast, supported woodlands and forests, not dense tropical rainforests, but open woodlands similar to what you'd find in southern Europe today. Trees providing shade, holding soil in place, creating habitats for countless species. Further south, across the central Sahara, the dominant vegetation was savanna. Imagine the East African grasslands, the Serengeti or the Masai Mara, that mix of grass and scattered trees that supports huge populations of grazing animals. That's what existed across the central Sahara during the humid period. Archaeological evidence shows extensive grasslands with seasonal variations, areas that would green up dramatically during rainy seasons and sustain herds through drier periods. These weren't marginal habitats where life struggled to survive. These were productive, resource-rich environments capable of supporting substantial populations of both animals and humans. The animal life in this Green Sahara reads like a list of species you'd expect to find in sub-Saharan Africa today, not in the world's largest desert. We know what lived there because they left evidence. The most spectacular evidence comes in the form of rock art. Thousands upon thousands of paintings and engravings scattered across the Sahara, concentrated in regions like the Tassili Naja Plateau in Algeria and the Caucasus Mountains in Libya. These aren't primitive stick figures. These are sophisticated, detailed artworks depicting the animals that ancient peoples hunted and herded, and what animals they were. The rock art shows hippos, not just one or two isolated images, but hundreds of hippopotamus paintings showing these massive semi-aquatic mammals living in Saharan rivers and lakes. Today, you have to go to sub-Saharan Africa to see hippos in the wild, but 8,000 years ago, they were common in the central Sahara, wallowing in rivers that no longer exist, breeding in lakes that are now dust. The paintings show them accurately too, Artists who clearly observed these animals closely rendered them with anatomical precision. They show hippos fighting, swimming, grazing on riverbanks. They show baby hippos alongside their mothers. This wasn't mythological art. This was documentary evidence of the world these people inhabited. The rock art also shows elephants. Not the desert-adapted elephants that occasionally appear in marginal Saharan regions today, but substantial populations of savanna elephants. The paintings depict entire herds, including calves, suggesting breeding populations that lived there permanently. There are giraffes browsing on trees that no longer grow. There are rhinoceros, multiple species probably, shown with the characteristic body shapes and horn arrangements. There are antelopes of various kinds, gazelles, and hartebeest, the same species that live in African savannas today. The paintings show predators too. Lions are common subjects shown hunting and feeding. There are paintings of wild dogs, cheetahs, and leopards. The entire African megafauna community, the ecological assemblage that we now associate exclusively with sub-Saharan Africa, lived in the Sahara during the humid period. But perhaps the most telling evidence comes from crocodiles. Ancient Saharan peoples left paintings and engravings of crocodiles across regions that are now among the driest places on Earth. And we're not just talking about artistic representations. Archaeologists have found actual crocodile fossils in the Sahara. Crocodile bones in lake beds that dried up thousands of years ago. Crocodile teeth in caves that once overlooked rivers. These weren't occasional visitors or animals that got lost and died. These were established populations living in permanent water bodies. Some researchers estimate that during the humid period's peak, crocodiles occupied every major river and lake system in the Sahara. That means there were crocodiles lounging on riverbanks in what is now central Libya. Crocodiles hunting fish in lakes that existed where there's now nothing but sand dunes. The mind struggles to picture it, but the evidence is irrefutable. The fish populations were substantial enough to support specialized fishing cultures. Archaeological sites throughout the Sahara have yielded fish bones, fish hooks, and harpoons. Some ancient settlements show evidence of fish processing on an almost industrial scale. Massive accumulations of fish bones indicating that fishing wasn't just supplementary to hunting and gathering, it was a primary food source. These weren't people occasionally catching a fish or two. These were communities that depended on aquatic resources the way coastal peoples do. Scientists have identified bones from Nile perch, catfish, and tilapia in sites that are now hundreds of miles from the nearest permanent water. The same species that live in African rivers today were swimming in Saharan rivers thousands of years ago. The human inhabitants of this Green Sahara lived lives that would be completely impossible in the same regions today. During the early part of the humid period, roughly 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, the people were primarily hunter-gatherers. They moved seasonally, following game animals and exploiting wild plant resources. Archaeological sites from this period show sophisticated stone tool technologies, evidence of controlled fire use, and organized camp structures. These weren't desperate people eking out a marginal existence. These were successful populations living in an environment that provided abundance. Then something revolutionary happened. Around 8,000 years ago, the rock art changes. Suddenly, alongside the wild animals, we start seeing cattle. Not wild aurochs, which were the ancestors of domestic cattle, but clearly domesticated animals being herded by humans. The paintings show people with staffs managing large herds. They show cattle being milked. They show corrals and pastoral settlements. The Green Sahara witnessed one of the independent developments of pastoralism in human history. People who had been hunting wild animals began managing domestic herds, creating a sustainable food source that could support larger, more stable populations. This pastoral revolution in the Green Sahara was profound. It wasn't just a new way of getting food, it was a fundamental reorganization of society. Herders needed to manage resources carefully, rotating grazing areas to prevent overuse. They needed to plan ahead, saving fodder for dry seasons. They needed to cooperate with neighboring groups, establishing territories and water rights. The social structures necessary for successful pastoralism are complex, requiring long-term thinking, property concepts, and sophisticated inter-group negotiations. All of this was happening in the Green Sahara thousands of years before similar developments in many other parts of the world. The archaeological evidence for these pastoral communities is remarkable. Sites like Yobero in Niger have revealed cemeteries with hundreds of burials spanning thousands of years. These weren't temporary camps. These were permanent or semi-permanent settlements where people returned generation after generation. The graves contain evidence of social differentiation. Some individuals buried with elaborate grave goods, beaded jewellery, polished stone bracelets, decorated pottery, others with simpler burials. This suggests these societies had developed social hierarchies, specialists, and cultural complexity. The skeletons themselves tell stories. Bone chemistry analysis reveals diets rich in fish and wild game early in the sequence, then increasingly focused on domestic cattle and other herded animals later. We can literally see the pastoral revolution written in human bones. The pottery from Green Sahara sites is spectacular. Some of the earliest pottery in Africa comes from the Sahara during the humid period. And this wasn't crude, utilitarian pottery. This was artistic expression, elaborate geometric designs, carefully incised patterns. Some vessels show remarkable craftsmanship, thin walls, smooth surfaces, sophisticated firing techniques. The pottery styles changed over time and varied across regions, allowing archaeologists to trace cultural connections and population movements across thousands of miles and thousands of years. But here's what's really incredible. We only rediscovered this lost world relatively recently. For most of modern history, the idea that the Sahara had once been green was considered ridiculous. The desert seemed eternal, unchangeable, a permanent feature of the Earth's geography. Then scientists started looking beneath the surface. Literally. The discovery of the Green Sahara is one of the great scientific detective stories of the 20th and 21st centuries. It came together piece by piece, line of evidence by line of evidence, until the picture became undeniable. Satellite imaging was crucial. Starting in the 1980s, space-based radar systems that could penetrate sand began revealing what were hidden beneath the desert. Ancient river channels appeared on satellite images like ghosts, their courses still visible in subtle variations in sand depth and soil composition. Lake beds showed up as distinctive features, their extent measurable from space. Suddenly, scientists could map an entire lost river network without ever setting foot in the desert. They could see that the Sahara was crisscrossed with ancient waterways, dotted with vanished lakes, fundamentally different from the desert that exists today. Sediment cores provided the detailed history. Scientists drilled into ancient lake beds, extracting columns of sediment that had accumulated over thousands of years. Each layer was like a page in a history book. The deepest layers, from the height of the humid period, contained pollen from trees and grasses, plant species that required abundant rainfall. They contained freshwater diatoms, microscopic algae that only live in permanent bodies of water. They contained chemical signatures indicating high lake levels and extensive vegetation. Moving up through the core through progressively younger layers, the evidence showed the gradual drying, tree pollen declining, grass pollen becoming dominant, then desert scrub species appearing, then nothing but dust and sand. The sediments recorded the entire transformation from paradise to desert. Archaeological surveys added human evidence to the environmental data. Teams of researchers walked across the Sahara, mapping ancient sites, collecting artifacts, documenting rock art. The distribution of archaeological sites matched the pattern of ancient water sources revealed by satellites. Every major paleolake had human settlements around its shores. Every ancient river had camps and villages along its banks. The correlation was perfect. Where there was water, during the humid period there were people. Where water disappeared, people left. The human story and the environmental story were completely intertwined. Climate modeling helped explain why this transformation happened, but we'll get to that mechanism soon. For now, what matters is understanding that this wasn't a gradual, subtle environmental change. This was a complete transformation of an area larger than the United States. We're talking about roughly 9 million square kilometers of land that went from green and habitable to mostly uninhabitable desert. The largest hot desert on Earth today was once one of the most productive, resource-rich environments in Africa. And all of this was happening at exactly the right time for human development. The African humid period coincided with the Holocene, the current geological epoch that began after the last ice age ended. This was when human societies around the world were developing agriculture, building permanent settlements, creating increasingly complex cultures. In the Green Sahara, people weren't struggling to survive in a harsh environment. They were thriving in a productive one. The stable food sources from fishing, hunting, and herding meant populations could grow. The abundant water sources meant people didn't need to move constantly. They could establish semi-permanent settlements. The reliable climate meant knowledge and skills could accumulate across generations instead of being lost in constant survival crises. This created ideal conditions for cultural development. When people aren't spending every waking moment searching for food and water, they have time for other things: art, religion, social organization, technological innovation. The elaborate rock art of the Green Sahara shows people with leisure time to create. The sophisticated pottery shows craftspeople who could specialize. The organized cemeteries show societies with complex belief systems about death and the afterlife. The pastoral economy shows people planning for the future, managing resources across seasons and years. Some researchers think the Green Sahara may have been one of the crucibles where complex societies first developed in Africa. The population densities supportable in such a rich environment would have created both opportunities and challenges. Opportunities for trade, specialization, and cultural exchange. Challenges of resource management, territorial disputes, and social organization. These are exactly the pressures that drive societies toward increasing complexity, from simple bands of hunter-gatherers to larger tribal organizations to possibly even early chiefdoms with recognized leaders and social hierarchies. The genetic evidence supports this too. Studies of modern African populations show that many North African and sub-Saharan populations share common ancestry dating back to periods that coincide with the Green Sahara. People who lived in the fertile Sahara during the humid period became ancestors to populations now spread across Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe. The Green Sahara wasn't an isolated pocket of habitation. It was a population center, a source region that sent out migrants when conditions changed, spreading genes, technologies, and cultural practices across vast areas. And those conditions did change, dramatically, catastrophically. The Green Sahara didn't last. Around 6,000 years ago, things started going wrong. The rain began failing. Rivers started drying up. Lakes began shrinking. The grasslands withered. The forest died back. And the people who had lived there for thousands of years faced a terrible choice: stay and try to adapt to increasingly harsh conditions, or leave, abandoning the lands their ancestors had inhabited for hundreds of generations. Most left. They had to. But where they went and how they got there shaped human history in ways we're still uncovering today. Because that green paradise beneath the sand, it was the pump, the engine that pushed human populations out of Africa and into the rest of the world. Not once, but multiple times, in pulses that corresponded exactly with the climate cycles that made the Sahara bloom and die and bloom again. This wasn't random migration. This was a systematic pattern driven by environmental forces beyond human control. And understanding how it worked requires us to look at the climate engine itself, the mechanism that transformed the Sahara from paradise to hell and back again across hundreds of thousands of years. But before we go further into the human story, we need to understand the machine that drove it all. The climate engine that transformed the Sahara from paradise to hell and back again, over and over, for hundreds of thousands of years. 'Cause here's the thing about the Green Sahara. It wasn't some random accident of weather, some lucky break that happened once and never again. It was a cycle, a predictable, repeating pattern driven by forces so vast and so powerful that they literally tilted the planet. And understanding this cycle, this pump mechanism, is the key to understanding why humans left Africa when they did, how they survived, and ultimately why we exist at all. The story starts 93 million miles away, with Earth's relationship to the Sun. Most people think that relationship is constant. Earth orbits the Sun provides heat and light, seasons come and go in predictable patterns. Simple, right? Wrong. Earth's orbit isn't constant at all. It's constantly changing, shifting, wobbling like a spinning top that's starting to lose momentum. And these changes, small as they seem, are enough to completely transform entire continents. The man who figured this out was a Serbian mathematician named Milutin Milankovic. In the early 20th century, while World War I raged around him, he was doing calculations that would revolutionize our understanding of climate. He identified 3 main ways Earth's orbit changes over time, 3 cycles that interact to create the climate patterns that have shaped human evolution. Scientists now call them Milankovitch cycles, and they're the reason the Sahara has greened and dried repeatedly throughout human history. The first cycle is eccentricity. Earth's orbit around the Sun isn't a perfect circle. It's an ellipse, which means sometimes we're closer to the Sun, and sometimes we're farther away. But the shape of that ellipse changes over roughly 100,000-year cycles. Sometimes the orbit is nearly circular, sometimes it's more stretched out. When the orbit is more elliptical, the difference in solar radiation between Earth's closest and farthest points from the Sun becomes more extreme. This affects seasonal contrasts and can trigger ice ages and warming periods. The second cycle is obliquity. That's just a fancy word for the tilt of Earth's axis. Right now, Earth is tilted about 23.5 degrees relative to its orbital plane. That tilt is what gives us seasons. When the northern hemisphere is tilted toward the Sun, we get summer. When it's tilted away, we get winter. But the amount of tilt changes over a cycle of about 41,000 years. It varies between about 22.1 and 24.5 degrees. That might not sound like much, but a difference of just 4 degrees in Earth's tilt is enough to dramatically change climate patterns across the entire planet. More tilt means more extreme seasons, hotter summers, colder winters. Less tilt means milder seasons, but can also weaken the atmospheric circulation patterns that drive monsoons. The third cycle, and this is the big one for the Sahara, is precession. Earth doesn't just spin like a perfect top, it wobbles. The axis of rotation slowly traces out a circle, like a spinning top does just before it falls over, except Earth takes about 26,000 years to complete one wobble. This precession cycle changes which hemisphere is tilted toward the Sun during perihelion, the point in Earth's orbit when we're closest to the Sun. Right now, the northern hemisphere is tilted away from the Sun during perihelion. That means northern hemisphere winters occur when Earth is closest to the Sun, making them milder, and northern hemisphere summers occur when Earth is farthest from the Sun, making them less intense. But about 10,000 years ago it was opposite. The northern hemisphere was tilted toward the Sun during perihelion. Northern hemisphere summers were incredibly intense. The solar radiation hitting North Africa during summer was about 8% stronger than it is today. 8% might not sound like much, but when you're talking about the energy that drives entire atmospheric circulation systems, 8% is enormous. And here's where the Sahara Pump really kicks in. That extra summer solar radiation didn't just make North Africa a little warmer, it triggered a cascade of feedback mechanisms that completely transformed the continent. The increased solar heating caused the land to warm more than the adjacent oceans. Hot air over land rises, creating a low-pressure system. Air from over the Atlantic Ocean, laden with moisture, rushed in to fill that low-pressure zone. This is how monsoons work. Temperature differences between land and sea create pressure differences that pull moisture inland. Normally, North Africa's monsoon system is weak. The Sahara Desert itself creates a barrier. Dry air doesn't hold much heat, so the temperature contrast between land and sea isn't dramatic enough to pull the monsoon very far north. But when Earth's precession cycle amplifies summer solar radiation, everything changes. The land heats more intensely, the pressure gradient strengthens, and the African monsoon, which today peters out around 15 degrees north latitude, suddenly reaches all the way to 25 or even 30 degrees north. Rains that normally fall only in the Sahel, the transitional zone south of the Sahara, start drenching the entire desert. Rivers begin flowing again in wadis that have been dry for millennia. Vegetation springs up wherever water touches soil. And then the real magic happens. The feedback loops kick in. See, vegetation changes everything. Plants transpire, releasing moisture into the atmosphere. This increases local humidity, which means more clouds, which means more rain. More rain means more plants, which means more transpiration, which means even more rain. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. Once it gets started, it accelerates. Within just a few centuries, maybe faster, the entire Sahara can transform from barren desert to grassland and savanna. This is what climate scientists call a tipping point, a threshold where the system doesn't just gradually change, it flips from one stable state to another almost overnight in geological terms. The Sahara has at least two stable states, desert and grassland, and the Milankovitch cycles, particularly precession, provide the push that tips it from one state to the other. But there's more to the pump mechanism than just orbital cycles and monsoons. Ocean temperatures play a crucial role too. The Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean are like massive heat batteries. They store solar energy and release it slowly, influencing atmospheric circulation patterns across the entire region. When the Atlantic is warmer, it provides more moisture for the monsoon system to pull inland. When it's cooler, the monsoon weakens even if the orbital configuration is favourable. The Mediterranean acts like a moisture source for weather systems moving across North Africa from east to west. A warmer Mediterranean means more evaporation, more water vapour in the atmosphere, more potential for rainfall across the Sahara. During Green Sahara periods, both oceans were typically warmer than they are today. The combination of favourable orbital configuration and warm ocean temperatures created perfect conditions for the monsoon system to penetrate far into what is now desert. But the ocean temperatures themselves were partially driven by the orbital cycles. More intense northern hemisphere summers meant more solar energy absorbed by surface waters. Warmer waters meant enhanced evaporation. Enhanced evaporation meant more moisture for the monsoon. Everything connected, everything reinforcing everything else. Scientists studying lake sediments in what is now the heart of the Sahara have identified at least 230 separate humid periods over the past 8 million years. 230 times the desert has greened. 230 times it has dried again. The cycle repeats with remarkable regularity, driven by the precession cycle's roughly 20,000-year periodicity. But not all Green Sahara periods were equal. Some were wetter and lasted longer than others, depending on how the three Milankovitch cycles aligned. When precession, obliquity and eccentricity all work together to maximize northern hemisphere summer solar radiation, the Sahara didn't just green, it flooded. Lakes appeared that were larger than the Great Lakes of North America. Rivers flowed that would rival the Congo or the Amazon. These superhumid periods were the ones that most dramatically affected human evolution and migration. The most recent Green Sahara period, the one that ended about 5,000 years ago, was relatively moderate compared to some earlier cycles. But even this moderate greening was enough to transform the region completely and enable massive human populations to thrive in what is now uninhabitable desert. Earlier Green Sahara periods, occurring during more favourable orbital alignments, would have been even more dramatic. Some scientists think certain humid periods may have transformed the Sahara into something resembling the modern Serengeti or the savannas of East Africa. Vast grasslands dotted with trees, supporting enormous populations of large mammals and the human groups that hunted them. But here's where the pump metaphor really comes into play. The same mechanism that greens the Sahara also dries it. The precession cycle doesn't just strengthen the monsoon, it also, inevitably, weakens it again as Earth's wobble continues. As the northern hemisphere's tilt during perihelion gradually shifts back toward its current configuration, summer solar radiation decreases. The land doesn't heat as intensely. The pressure gradient that drives the monsoon weakens. Less moisture penetrates inland. And then the feedback loops that created the Green Sahara start running in reverse. Reduced rainfall means some vegetation dies off. Less vegetation means less transpiration. Less transpiration means even less rainfall. The soil dries out and begins reflecting more sunlight instead of absorbing it. This increases surface temperatures, which paradoxically can actually suppress rainfall by creating unstable atmospheric conditions that prevent clouds from forming. Within centuries, the grasslands begin reverting to desert. Within a millennium or two, the transformation is complete. The rivers dry up, the lakes evaporate, the animals migrate south toward the Sahel or die. And the humans who had built entire societies around Saharan resources face a choice: stay and die, or move, This is the pump, the Sahara alternately filling with life and emptying, like a vast biological reservoir that fills during favourable orbital periods and drains during unfavourable ones. When it fills, human populations expand into the region from surrounding areas. They multiply, develop new technologies, establish trade networks, create cultures. When it drains, they're forced out, pushed into surrounding regions, pushed into Europe via the Mediterranean coast, pushed into Asia via the Nile Valley and the Middle East, pushed deeper into sub-Saharan Africa following the retreating grasslands. Some researchers have calculated that during Green Sahara periods, the region could have supported human populations in the hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. During dry periods, those numbers would drop to nearly zero in the desert interior. This represents one of the most dramatic population pumps in human history. Hundreds of thousands of people forced to migrate every 20,000 years or so, carrying their genes, their technologies, their cultural innovations to new regions. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this pump mechanism operated dozens of times, each cycle pushing a new wave of African humans out into Europe and Asia, each wave carrying slightly different genetic variants, slightly different stone tool traditions, slightly different survival strategies learned during the previous Green Sahara period. The pump also worked in reverse, though probably less dramatically. During dry periods, human populations in North Africa would contract and fragment. But during the transition to Green Sahara conditions, the region would become attractive again. Human groups from surrounding areas, groups that had been pushed out during the previous dry period or descended from those who had, would move back in. They'd bring with them whatever innovations they'd developed in exile. New tool designs, new hunting strategies, new social organizations. The Sahara during green periods would become a melting pot where different human populations met, mixed, and exchanged ideas. This might explain some of the puzzling patterns we see in the archaeological record. Stone tool traditions that appear suddenly in North Africa with clear connections to Middle Eastern or European designs. Skeletal remains showing genetic mixing between populations. Evidence of long-distance trade networks connecting the Sahara to the Mediterranean, the Nile Valley, and sub-Saharan Africa. The pump created opportunities for human populations that had been isolated for thousands of years to suddenly encounter each other again in the greening desert. But the pump mechanism also created something else: evolutionary pressure. Think about what happens to human populations going through these cycles. Every 20,000 years, your people either adapt to dramatically changing conditions or die. When the Sahara greens, you need to be able to quickly exploit new resources, learn to hunt the animals that move in, identify which plants are edible, find reliable water sources, establish territories before competing groups do. When the Sahara dries, you need to be able to recognize the signs. Notice that the rains are coming less frequently. See that the game animals are becoming scarce. Have the social organization to coordinate a migration before starvation sets in. And you need to be able to actually execute that migration. Move your entire group, possibly hundreds of miles, into unfamiliar territory where you'll face new challenges and probably encounter other human groups who aren't thrilled about newcomers competing for their resources. Over hundreds of thousands of years, this pump mechanism selected for humans who were flexible, innovative, cooperative, and capable of long-term planning. Groups that were too rigid in their survival strategies got caught in the Sahara when it dried and died. Groups that were too disorganized to coordinate migrations fell apart during the journey. Groups that couldn't negotiate or fight effectively when they encountered other populations in their destination, territories were absorbed or eliminated. The survivors, the ones whose genes made it through multiple pump cycles, were the ones who could handle rapid environmental change, who could learn new skills quickly, who could maintain social cooperation under stress, who could compete successfully with other human groups when necessary. And here's the kicker. This wasn't happening to one isolated human population. It was happening to multiple populations simultaneously across a region larger than the continental United States. Different groups adapted to the pump in different ways. Some became specialists in rapid migration, developing the technologies and social structures that let them move quickly when conditions changed. Others became specialists in refugee survival, finding isolated pockets where water persisted even during dry periods, and defending those refugia fiercely. Still others became generalists, developing survival strategies that worked across a wide range of environments. When these differently adapted populations encountered each other during Green Sahara periods, they would compete, interbreed, and exchange innovations. The result was a kind of evolutionary laboratory. Natural selection operating on multiple human populations simultaneously, but with enough gene flow between groups to prevent complete speciation, while still maintaining distinct regional adaptations. Over the past 500,000 years, the Sahara Pump has cycled at least 25 times. 25 opportunities for human populations to be shuffled, mixed, and tested against changing environments. 25 waves of migration pushing African humans into Eurasia, and sometimes pulling them back. It's no coincidence that many of the most important developments in human evolution coincide with major Green Sahara periods. The refinement of stone tool technology, the development of systematic hunting strategies, the emergence of symbolic behavior and art, the expansion of modern humans out of Africa. All of these developments occurred during or immediately after major humid periods when the Sahara Pump was creating exactly the conditions that would favour rapid cultural and technological innovation. We're all products of the pump. Every human alive today descended from ancestors who survived multiple Sahara climate cycles, who learned to read the signs of environmental change, who maintained the social bonds necessary to coordinate migrations, who adapted quickly enough to exploit new resources in new environments. The pump made us adaptable. It made us innovative. It made us human. And the truly mind-blowing part? The pump is still running. The Milankovitch cycles haven't stopped. Earth's orbit continues to change in predictable patterns. The precession cycle continues its slow wobble, which means the Sahara will green again. In fact, it's already beginning. But here's where the story gets absolutely wild. The Sahara Pump didn't just create conditions for modern humans to leave Africa 60,000 years ago. That famous exodus, the one that populated the entire world, the one we always hear about in documentaries. That was just the most recent pulse, the last time the pump activated. Before that, the mechanism had been running for millions of years, pushing human species out of Africa again and again and again. Every time the Sahara turned green, humans tried to leave. Every time the desert returned, those who had ventured out were cut off from their African homeland, forced to adapt or die in whatever new territory they'd reached. The pump didn't just move humanity, it created the conditions for human evolution itself. Let's go back, way back, to around 2 million years ago, when the first human species, Homo erectus, was just beginning to figure out this whole being human thing. They were impressive for their time, taller than their ancestors, with larger brains and better tools. They had figured out fire, developed more sophisticated hunting techniques, and could process foods that their predecessors couldn't digest. But they were still confined to Africa, still limited to the territories where they'd evolved, because between them and the rest of the world stood an impossible barrier, the Sahara Desert. Even 2 million years ago, when a desert wasn't as extreme as it would later become, it was still a formidable obstacle. Hundreds of miles of arid wasteland with no reliable water sources, no game animals to hunt, no edible plants to gather. A death trap for any human foolish enough to try crossing it. Then the climate shifted. The African humid period kicked in, not the recent one from 11,000 years ago, an ancient one, driven by the same orbital mechanics but occurring in a different geological epoch. The monsoons returned, the Sahara bloomed, and suddenly, for the first time in human history, there was a bridge, a green corridor stretching from East Africa all the way to the Mediterranean coast and beyond. Rivers flowing year-round. Lakes scatter across what had been barren rock. Grasslands supporting herds of animals that had never been seen in North Africa before. For Homo erectus populations living in East Africa, this must have seemed like a miracle. New territories opening up where none had existed before. Resources that had been locked behind an impassable barrier suddenly becoming accessible. They moved north, not in one coordinated migration, nothing that organized, just small groups following game animals into new territories, setting up camps near water sources, discovering that the lands beyond the desert could support human life just as well as their ancestral homelands. Within a few thousand years, which is remarkably fast in evolutionary terms, Homo erectus populations had spread across the entire Green Sahara. Archaeological sites from this period tell the story. At Ain Hanesh in Algeria, researchers found stone tools and butchered animal bones dating to 1.8 million years ago. This is among the earliest evidence of human presence outside of East Africa. The tools are crude by later standards, simple choppers and scrapers, but they prove that humans had successfully crossed the Sahara and established themselves in North Africa. At Thomas Quarries in Morocco, more Homo erectus remains dating to around 1 million years ago show that these populations weren't just passing through. They were settling, building communities, adapting to local conditions. But the most important route wasn't across the Sahara itself, it was around the edges, through what archaeologists call the Levantine Corridor. This was the eastern route, the highway to everywhere. Starting in the East African Rift Valley, where humans first evolved, the corridor ran north through the Nile Valley, then branched northeast through the Sinai Peninsula into the Levant. What's now Israel, Lebanon, Syria, Jordan. From there, the world opened up, east into Asia, north into Europe, west back across North Africa. During dry periods, this corridor was barely passable. The Sinai became a harsh desert. The Levant dried into scrubland that could barely support scattered gazelle herds, let alone human populations. But when the Sahara Pump activated, when the African humid period returned, everything changed. The Nile, fed by increased rainfall across East Africa, became a superhighway of resources. Its banks supported dense vegetation, its waters teemed with fish. Game animals congregated along its shores in numbers that would seem impossible today. Human groups could follow the Nile north for thousands of miles, never more than a day's walk from water and food. When they reached the Mediterranean coast, the Sinai Peninsula was no longer a barrier. During humid periods, it transformed into a continuation of the Nile Delta ecosystem. Wetlands and seasonal rivers, coastal lagoons rich with fish and waterfowl, enough resources to support migrating human populations as they crossed from Africa into Asia. The archaeological evidence for these ancient crossings is scattered but compelling. At Ubeidiya in Israel, just south of the Sea of Galilee, researchers found stone tools and animal bones dating to 5 million years ago. The tools match styles used by Homo erectus in East Africa, suggesting these were recent migrants, humans who had crossed through the Levantine corridor when conditions were favourable. At Gesher Benot Yaakov, also in Israel, even more remarkable finds. A site dating to 790,000 years ago, where Homo erectus populations weren't just surviving, they were thriving. The site contains evidence of controlled fire use, something that would have been absolutely critical for humans expanding into cooler climates outside of tropical Africa. They were also processing nuts and seeds in ways that show sophisticated understanding of food preparation. They had learned to crack open hard shells, probably using stone anvils. They were roasting certain plants to make them more digestible. This wasn't just survival, this was innovation. Humans taking knowledge developed in Africa and adapting it to new environments. But here's what's really fascinating. These early expansions weren't one-way trips. The humans who left Africa during green periods didn't just keep going until they ran out of land. They established territories, built populations. Then when the climate shifted again, when the Sahara Pump reversed and the desert returned, they were cut off. Some populations probably tried to return to Africa, only to find the route blocked by expanding deserts. Others pushed further into Asia or Europe, seeking new territories as their established ranges became less hospitable. Many probably went extinct. Small isolated populations overwhelmed by climate changes they couldn't predict or understand. But some survived. And these survivors, separated from their African relatives for hundreds of thousands of years, began evolving in new directions. The fossil record from this period shows increasing diversity in human forms. Homo erectus in Asia began developing distinctive features: thicker skull bones, more robust jaw structures, adaptations to local foods and climates. Homo heidelbergensis emerged in Europe and Africa around 700,000 years ago, larger-brained than Homo erectus, with tool technologies that showed clear regional variations. They were the descendants of earlier migrants, populations that had been separated long enough to evolve distinct characteristics, but not so long that they became entirely separate species. This pattern repeated over and over. Green Sahara opens, humans expand out of Africa, desert returns, populations become isolated, evolution creates diversity, next green period arrives, new wave of migrants encounters the descendants of earlier expansions. It was like a biological ratchet, each pulse of the Sahara Pump adding another layer of complexity to human evolution. Each expansion testing human adaptability in new ways, and the challenges these migrants faced were intense. Leaving Africa meant leaving everything familiar. The plants you knew were edible might not exist in your new territory. The animals you'd learned to hunt, different species with different behaviors in different environments. The weather patterns you'd relied on for knowing when to move camp, or when to expect seasonal resources, completely different outside of tropical Africa. During dry periods, these challenges were often fatal. Human populations that had ventured beyond Africa during green times found themselves trapped in territories that could barely support them. But when the Sahara was green, when the pump was active, migration became not just possible, but almost easy. Water sources were everywhere. Lakes, rivers, seasonal streams that meant you never had to carry water for more than a few hours of walking. Game animals were abundant. grasslands supported massive herds of antelope, gazelle, wild cattle. Anywhere humans could walk, they could find something to hunt. Edible plants were diverse and plentiful. The same ecological richness that made the Green Sahara a paradise for animals made it a buffet for human migrants. Fruits, nuts, seeds, tubers, roots. Experienced foragers could find food almost anywhere. This abundance meant human populations could afford to take risks. Small groups could split off from larger communities and explore new territories without condemning themselves to starvation. If things didn't work out, they could usually make their way back to more familiar regions. If they succeeded in finding good new territories, they could establish permanent settlements and begin reproducing. Over generations, this created a pattern of expansion that archaeologists can trace in the fossil record. During humid periods, human sites spread rapidly across North Africa and into the Levant. Tool styles show clear connections to East African technologies, proof that these were recent migrants bringing knowledge from their homelands. Then, when the desert returned and the Sahara Pump reversed, new sites stop appearing. The archaeological record shows existing populations either adapting to new conditions or disappearing entirely. Regional tool styles begin diverging as isolated populations develop their own technologies. The evidence for these cycles comes from multiple sources. Lake sediment cores from across North Africa show repeated wet and dry periods stretching back millions of years. When researchers find human fossils or tools, they can often date them by determining which humid period they correspond to. Stone tools found in former lake beds must have been left during wet periods when those lakes existed. Sites in now barren deserts make sense only if we understand they were once green corridors. One of the most important archaeological sites for understanding these early expansions is in the central Sahara, the Tassili Nadja Plateau in Algeria. Today it's one of the most desolate places on Earth. Rock and sand under brutal sun. But scattered across the plateau are thousands of ancient rock paintings, created over many periods by different cultures, the oldest dating to around 12,000 years ago, but depicting scenes that could only have occurred during green periods. Paintings of hippopotamuses wallowing in rivers, elephants migrating across grasslands, humans herding cattle, hunting giraffe, fishing in now vanished lakes. These aren't fantasies. They're memories preserved in stone. Records of times when the Sahara was green and humans thrived in places we now consider uninhabitable. But more than just paintings, the plateau contains tools and campsites dating to much earlier periods. Some sites show evidence of human occupation during humid periods, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years. Different human species coming and going as the climate fluctuated, all using the same green corridors, all following the same pattern of expansion when conditions allowed. Another crucial site is in Libya, the Messac Setafet escarpment. In 2007, researchers found stone tools in ancient lake beds dating to around 350,000 years ago. The tools were sophisticated, carefully shaped hand axes and blades that show clear planning and skill in manufacture. But what's really significant is their location. Deep in what's now one of the driest parts of the Sahara, the people who made these tools weren't struggling to survive in a marginal environment. They were thriving in a well-watered landscape, probably during a humid period when the region supported enough resources for long-term occupation. These sites tell us something profound about human adaptability. The same species that evolved in tropical East Africa could successfully colonize Mediterranean climates, temperate forests, even arid grasslands. Each environment required different survival strategies, different tools, different knowledge about local resources. But early human species proved capable of acquiring that knowledge and passing it to subsequent generations. This adaptability was itself an evolutionary advantage. Human populations that developed the cognitive flexibility to learn new survival strategies in new environments were more successful than populations locked into rigid behavioral patterns. Over millions of years, natural selection favored intelligence, problem-solving ability, the capacity to innovate when faced with unfamiliar challenges. Every time the Sahara Pump activated, every time humans expanded into new territories, it created selection pressure for these traits. The individuals who could figure out which new plants were edible, which animals could be hunted successfully, how to find water in unfamiliar landscapes, these were the ones who survived and reproduced. Their genes, carrying whatever neurological architecture had made them more adaptable, spread through the population. By the time modern humans emerged around 300,000 years ago, we were the products of millions of years of this selection pressure. Our ancestors had been crossing the Sahara Pump for so long that adaptability itself had become one of our defining characteristics. We weren't just another animal species responding to environmental changes. We were a species shaped by environmental changes, forged by repeated cycles of expansion and isolation. And those earlier expansions, the Homo erectus populations that left Africa 2 million years ago, the Homo heidelbergensis groups that followed hundreds of thousands of years later, they laid the groundwork for what was coming. They proved that humans could survive outside of Africa. They established populations in Europe and Asia that would eventually evolve into Neanderthals and Denisovans. They developed technologies and survival strategies that would be passed down through countless generations. Most importantly, they showed that the Sahara Pump worked, that when conditions were right, Africa's barriers could become bridges. That human expansion wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. Every green period created opportunities, every humid phase opened new routes. The pump had been priming humanity for millions of years, building populations, testing adaptations, spreading human species across multiple continents, setting the stage for what would become the most important expansion of all. The one that happened 60,000 years ago, when modern humans finally left Africa carrying all the genetic and cultural innovations that had accumulated over millions of years of previous pulses. But that's getting ahead of the story. For now, what matters is understanding that human expansion out of Africa wasn't a single event. It was a process, a repeated cycle driven by climate mechanisms that humans didn't understand but couldn't avoid. The Sahara Pump had been moving humanity since the very beginning, pushing, testing, selecting, creating the conditions under which our ancestors would become the most adaptable, most innovative, most successful species the world had ever seen. And it all started with that first pulse, that first Green Sahara, 2 million years ago, when Homo erectus looked north and saw, for the first time, a bridge to the rest of the world. But here's the thing about paradise. It never lasts. Around 6,000 years ago, your ancestors, living in the Green Sahara, started noticing something was wrong. Not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly, year by year, generation by generation, the world they knew was beginning to die. The first signs were subtle. The annual rains that had come like clockwork for thousands of years started arriving a few days late, then a week late. Some years they were lighter than usual. Not enough to cause immediate disaster, but enough that the old people started muttering about how things used to be different, how the rains used to be stronger, how the grass used to grow taller. Nobody panicked. Not yet. Because climate varies naturally, right? Every few generations there's a dry period. You tighten your belts, move your herds to better pastures, wait for the good years to return. That's what your people had been doing for thousands of years. They were experts at adapting to climate fluctuations. Except this time, the good years didn't come back. What was happening? The same orbital mechanics that had turned the Sahara green were now working in reverse. Remember that 41,000-year cycle of axial tilt? That shift in Earth's wobble that had intensified the African monsoons? It was shifting again. The northern hemisphere summers were becoming less intense. The temperature contrast between land and ocean that had driven moisture deep into North Africa was weakening. The monsoons were failing, and this time they weren't coming back for at least another 15,000 years. The drying didn't happen overnight. This wasn't like someone turning off a faucet. It was more like someone very slowly turning down the flow, so gradually that you might not notice day to day, but over years and decades, the change became undeniable. The lake your great-great-grandparents had lived beside, the one that had seemed eternal, started shrinking. Each year the waterline retreated a little further. Beaches appeared where there'd been deep water. Islands emerged that nobody had ever seen before. The fish that had fed your people for generations became harder to catch. The flocks of water birds that had darkened the sky during migration started bypassing your region entirely, flying further south to find reliable water. The grasslands started thinning. Those vast golden seas of grass that had supported enormous herds of antelope, wild cattle, and elephants, they began developing bare patches. First small spots of exposed sand, then larger areas where nothing grew. The herds noticed before the humans did. They started moving, following the retreating grasslands southward and eastward, seeking the regions where rain still fell reliably. Some humans followed the animals. Archaeological evidence shows mass migrations beginning around 5,500 years ago. Entire populations packing up their lives and moving toward the remaining sources of water. The Nile Valley started receiving refugees. So did the Niger River Basin, Lake Chad, the Atlas, mountain foothills, anywhere that still had reliable moisture. But here's what makes this story so heartbreaking. The drying wasn't uniform. It was patchy, unpredictable, cruel in its randomness. Your valley might become uninhabitable, while the valley 50 miles away remained green for another century. Some regions died fast, others lingered in a state of slow decline that lasted generations. This created a kind of desperate climate lottery. If your ancestors chose the right place to settle, they might buy themselves and their children another few generations of good living. Choose wrong, and they'd be moving again in a decade, competing with other refugees for dwindling resources. The archaeological record from this period tells a story of increasing desperation. Settlements that had existed for hundreds of years were suddenly abandoned, not because of war or disease, but simply because the water dried up. You can trace this in the sediment cores, layers that show continuous human occupation, pottery fragments, animal bones, charcoal from cooking fires, then suddenly nothing. Just windblown sand. Some communities tried to adapt in place. They dug deeper wells. They developed more efficient water storage techniques. They switched from farming to herding, or from herding to foraging. Archaeological sites from this transitional period show incredible ingenuity. People trying everything they could think of to stay in their ancestral homelands. But innovation has its limits. You can't invent your way around the absence of rain. The speed of the transformation would have been shocking to anyone living through it. While the overall drying took place over roughly 2,000 years, which sounds gradual, remember that's only about 80 human generations. Your great-grandparents lived beside a massive lake teeming with fish and wildlife. You're watching that same lake become a salty marsh. Your grandchildren will see it become a salt flat. Your great-great-grandchildren will wonder if the stories about water in this place are just myths. And it got worse. Because once the drying started, it created feedback loops that accelerated the collapse. Less vegetation meant less moisture being transpired back into the atmosphere, which meant less rain. Less rain meant fewer plants, which meant less moisture. The Sahara wasn't just drying. It was dying in a self-reinforcing spiral that nobody could stop. The lakes went first. Mega Chad, that enormous inland sea that had been larger than the Caspian Sea, started shrinking around 5,500 years ago. By 4,000 years ago, it had collapsed to a fraction of its former size. Today's Lake Chad, shared between Niger, Nigeria, Chad, and Cameroon, is a pathetic remnant, barely 1% of its Green Sahara size. The other Great Lakes followed similar trajectories. First they became brackish as evaporation concentrated salts. Then they separated into smaller lakes. Then those dried up, leaving only salt pans and the ghosts of shorelines. The rivers didn't disappear as dramatically, but they changed character completely. Permanent rivers became seasonal. Seasonal rivers became occasional. What had been navigable waterways that connected distant communities became chains of disconnected pools, then dry wadis that only flowed after rare rainstorms. The vast river networks that had sustained the Green Sahara for thousands of years simply stopped functioning. And the animals, they did what animals always do when their habitat becomes uninhabitable. They left, or they died, probably both. The archaeological and paleontological record from this period shows a mass extinction event playing out in slow motion. Species that had thrived in the Green Sahara for thousands of years started disappearing from the fossil record. First, the most water-dependent species, hippos and crocodiles retreating to the Nile and Niger. Then the grazers, following the failing grasslands south. Finally, even the hardy desert-adapted species found themselves in trouble as the remaining vegetation disappeared. The humans who stayed behind had to become different people. The cattle herders became camel herders, switching to animals that could survive on less water. The settled farmers became nomads again, moving constantly to exploit scattered resources. The fishers became traders, using their knowledge of the drying landscape to guide caravans between the remaining settlements. These weren't choices, they were desperate adaptations to a world that was becoming unrecognizable. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because while the drying Sahara was a catastrophe for the people living there, it became the foundation for one of history's greatest civilizations. All those climate refugees had to go somewhere, and the place many of them went was the Nile Valley. The Nile had always been important, but as the Sahara dried, it became everything. A narrow ribbon of fertility in an expanding desert. The last reliable water source in a dying landscape. Archaeological evidence shows the Nile Valley's population exploding between 6,000 and 5,000 years ago. Not from high birth rates, from immigration. Saharan refugees bringing their knowledge, their technologies, their desperation for survival. These weren't primitive people fleeing blindly from disaster. These were the descendants of the Green Sahara's most sophisticated cultures. They brought advanced pottery techniques. They brought cattle domestication knowledge. They brought astronomical observations developed from millennia of monsoon-dependent farming. They brought social organization systems developed for managing complex irrigation networks. Most importantly, they brought the collective memory of their lost paradise and a determination to rebuild something comparable. Within a few centuries of the major migration waves, we see the emergence of what would become ancient Egyptian civilization. The timing isn't coincidental. The concentration of Saharan refugees along the Nile created the demographic pressure, the technological base, and the organizational necessity for complex state formation. You can't have tens of thousands of people living along a single river without developing sophisticated systems for resource management, conflict resolution, and collective labor organization. The Egyptian myths about the primordial waters, about chaos being pushed back by order, about the annual flooding of the Nile being the renewal of creation, those aren't just abstract religious concepts. They're cultural memories of the Green Sahara and its loss, transformed over generations into sacred narratives. The Egyptian obsession with controlling water, with irrigation, with measuring and predicting the Nile's floods, that makes perfect sense when you remember their ancestors watched an entire subcontinent dry up and die. And it wasn't just Egypt. Similar stories played out across the Sahara's margins. The Niger River basin received its own waves of climate refugees, leading to the development of the Nok culture and other West African civilizations. The Atlas Mountain region saw population concentrations that would eventually form the Berber kingdoms. The Chad basin became home to cultures that would influence civilizations across the Sahel. The cultural memory of the catastrophe survived for millennia. Greek historians reported Egyptian legends about vast grasslands and rivers where only desert now existed. Roman writers described Berber traditions of a green land lost to the gods' displeasure. Medieval Arab chronicles preserved stories of fertile Saharan regions from the ancient past. These weren't fantasies or exaggerations. They were distorted memories of real places, real environments that had existed and then vanished within recorded human memory. Because here's the thing about the speed of the transformation. While 2,000 years sounds gradual from our perspective, it was devastatingly fast for the people living through it. Your great-grandparents' generation might have known abundant water and green valleys. Your generation watches the desert advance. Your grandchildren's generation will know only sand. That's fast enough for the trauma to be remembered, slow enough that each generation normalized slightly worse conditions, never quite believing it could get as bad as it ultimately did. Modern climate science has helped us understand exactly what happened and why. Sediment cores from across the Sahara show the transition clearly. Around 6,000 years ago, you see pollen from tropical grasses, trees, aquatic plants, evidence of a diverse productive ecosystem. By 4,000 years ago, the pollen diversity collapses. Desert-adapted species replace moisture-loving ones. Charcoal layers that indicate frequent human fires disappear, replaced by sterile sand layers. The transformation is written in the geological record like a death certificate for an entire ecosystem, and it hasn't reversed. For 5,000 years, the Sahara has remained essentially as it is now, the world's largest hot desert, covering over 3.5 million square miles. Yes, there are small fluctuations. Some decades see slightly more rain. Some regions support a bit more vegetation, but nothing remotely resembling the Green Sahara has returned. The orbital mechanics that created it are in a different phase now. The atmospheric circulation patterns have stabilized in their current configuration. The feedback loops are now working to maintain the desert, not break it down. The people who stayed in the Sahara, who adapted to the new desert conditions, became something unique. The Tuareg, the Bedouin, the various desert-adapted cultures of North Africa, these are the descendants of people who learned to thrive in one of Earth's most hostile environments. Their cultures preserve techniques for finding water in seemingly waterless landscapes, for navigating by stars when every sand dune looks identical, for maintaining social networks across vast empty spaces. They're the inheritors of 5,000 years of desert survival expertise, but they also carry the memory of what was lost. Traditional songs speak of green valleys and flowing rivers. Ancient rock art scattered across the Sahara depicts hippos, giraffes and elephants in places that haven't seen rain in millennia. These aren't just art. They're monuments to a world that died, reminders that the landscape that seems eternal and unchanging was once radically different. The Great Drying created the modern Sahara, but it also created modern North African and Middle Eastern civilizations, driven by desperate refugees concentrating along the last reliable water sources. It created cultural memories of environmental catastrophe that influenced religions and philosophies for thousands of years. It demonstrated that even environments that seem stable and permanent can collapse within a handful of human generations. And it set the stage for the next chapter of the story, because those climate refugees didn't just build new civilizations along the Nile and Niger. They kept moving, kept adapting, kept spreading across Africa and beyond, carrying with them the survival skills learned from watching their world dry up and die. They were the descendants of the Green Sahara, and they were about to change the world. Here's something most people don't realize about human migration. We didn't just walk out of Africa once and spread across the world in one big wave. That's not how it happened. The reality is far more complex, far more interesting, and honestly far more human. When the Sahara went green, it didn't just create a pleasant landscape. It created highways, corridors of life cutting through what had been impassable barriers. And our ancestors, they didn't need maps or compasses. They just followed the water. Think about it. You're living in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe somewhere near Lake Chad or along the Niger River. For generations, your people have known that to the north lies only death, an ocean of sand stretching beyond comprehension. Then the rains come. First, just more reliable wet seasons, then permanent rivers, then forests, then grasslands teeming with animals, and suddenly the impossible becomes inevitable. You start moving north. But here's where the geography gets really important. The Green Sahara wasn't just one big meadow. It had structure. River systems that flowed in specific directions, mountain ranges that channeled movement, coastlines that offered predictable resources. And these geographical features created 3 major migration corridors, 3 distinct pathways that would shape the genetic and cultural landscape of the entire world. The first route, and probably the most important, was the northeastern corridor. This followed what would eventually become the Nile Valley, though during the Green Sahara periods it wasn't just the Nile. There were dozens of rivers flowing north toward the Mediterranean. These waterways created a natural highway from Central Africa all the way to the Sinai Peninsula. Archaeological sites along this route show continuous human occupation during green phases, then abandonment during arid periods, then reoccupation when the rains returned. It's like watching a tide come in and go out, except the tide is made of humans and the ocean is time itself. Groups moving along this northeastern corridor faced relatively gentle challenges. The climate gradient was gradual. You're not jumping from tropical Africa directly into Mediterranean environments. Instead, you're moving through a series of interconnected ecosystems, each one preparing you for the next. By the time you reach the Sinai, you've already adapted to drier conditions, more seasonal resources, different animal populations. You're ready for what comes next. And what came next was everything. because the Sinai Peninsula is the only land bridge between Africa and Eurasia. Every human who would eventually populate Europe, Asia, Australia, and the Americas, they all had to pass through this bottleneck. The genetic evidence for this is crystal clear. When you analyze the DNA of modern non-African populations, you see the signature of what geneticists call a founder effect, a dramatic reduction in genetic diversity compared to African populations, indicating that a relatively small group, maybe just a few hundred to a few thousand individuals, were the ancestors of everyone who had come after. This wasn't a one-time event. The archaeological and genetic evidence shows multiple waves of migration through the northeastern corridor, each one corresponding to a Green Sahara period. Around 120,000 years ago, an early wave of modern humans made it as far as the Levant, establishing populations that would persist for tens of thousands of years, before eventually going extinct or being absorbed back into African populations when the climate shifted again. Then came the big one. Around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, during one of the most intense Green Sahara phases, a group of humans left Africa, and this time they didn't come back. This is the migration that really matters for most of human history, the one that would eventually populate the entire world. Genetic analysis lets us trace this expansion with remarkable precision. The maternal lineages, traced through mitochondrial DNA, all point back to a small number of African women who lived around this time. The paternal lineages, traced through Y chromosome DNA, tell the same story. A handful of African men whose descendants would eventually number in the billions. But the northeastern corridor wasn't the only route out of Africa. The northwestern corridor was equally important, especially for populating Europe. This route followed rivers that flowed northwest from the Sahel region toward what is now Morocco and the Strait of Gibraltar. During Green Sahara periods, this wasn't the narrow waterway we know today. Sea levels were often lower, making the crossing easier. And the southern coast of Spain was visible from Africa on clear days. Archaeological evidence from both sides of the strait shows human populations moving back and forth during favourable climate periods. Stone tool technologies that originated in Africa show up in southern Spain. European tool innovations eventually make their way back to Morocco. This wasn't just migration. This was cultural exchange, a two-way flow of people, ideas, and technologies that would enrich both continents. The genetic signature of this northwestern route is still visible in modern populations. North African populations show distinctive genetic markers that separate them from both sub-Saharan Africans and Europeans, but with clear connections to both. They're genetically intermediate, which is exactly what you'd expect from populations living at a crossroads between continents. But here's what's really fascinating. Some genetic evidence suggests that early migrations through this northwestern corridor might have actually contributed to Neanderthal populations in Europe. Remember, Neanderthals and modern humans could interbreed. If early modern humans or their close relatives moved into southern Europe during very ancient Green Sahara phases, hundreds of thousands of years ago, they might have interbred with the Neanderthal populations already there. Some researchers think this could explain certain genetic anomalies in Neanderthal DNA that look suspiciously like they came from Africa. The third major corridor ran east, toward the Arabian Peninsula. During Green Sahara periods, the Arabian Peninsula wasn't the desert wasteland it is today. It was green too. The same climate patterns that brought rain to the Sahara also brought rain to Arabia. Rivers flowed, lakes formed, grasslands stretched from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf, and human populations followed the water, moving east from the Horn of Africa into this temporarily hospitable landscape. The archaeological evidence for this route is spectacular. Sites across Arabia show stone tool assemblages that are clearly related to African traditions, not European or Asian styles, but African methods of tool-making that had been carried across the Red Sea by migrating populations. Some of these sites date to over 100,000 years ago, indicating that humans were attempting to colonize Arabia during multiple Green Sahara phases. Genetic evidence supports this too. Modern Arabian populations show deep connections to East African populations, not just recent connections from the Islamic period or the slave trade, but ancient genetic links dating back tens of thousands of years. These are the signatures of the Green Sahara migrations, still visible in modern DNA after hundreds of generations. But here's where the story gets complicated, because none of these migrations were one-way trips. The Sahara Pump didn't just push people out of Africa and close the door behind them, it cycled. Green periods encouraged expansion, arid periods forced contraction. Green periods brought expansion again, and each time populations moved back and forth, creating what geneticists call admixture, the mixing of previously separated populations. The genetic evidence for this back-and-forth movement is written into our chromosomes. Modern North African populations show genetic contributions from sub-Saharan Africa, Europe and the Middle East, all layered together like geological strata. Each layer represents a different migration event, a different climate cycle, a different moment when the Sahara Pump opened the gates and let populations mix. This created something remarkable, a zone of genetic and cultural exchange that stretched from the tropics to the Mediterranean, from the Atlantic to the Red Sea. Ideas didn't have to wait for populations to migrate. They could spread through trade networks, through the movement of individuals between groups, through the gradual diffusion of innovations from one community to the next. Language families spread along these same routes. The Afroasiatic language family, which includes ancient Egyptian, Berber languages, Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew, and Cushitic languages from the Horn of Africa, almost certainly expanded during Green Sahara periods. The geographical distribution of these languages maps perfectly onto the major migration corridors. It's like looking at a linguistic fossil record of ancient population movements. But language wasn't the only thing spreading. Tool technologies moved along these corridors too. The Levallois technique, a sophisticated method of stone tool production that involves carefully preparing a stone core to produce identical blades, shows up across North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The distribution timing suggests it spread along the northeastern and northwestern corridors during a Green Sahara phase around 200,000 years ago. Even more remarkably, artistic traditions seem to have spread along these routes. Geometric engravings on ostrich eggshells, a distinctively African art form, show up in sites across the Sahara during green periods. Ochre processing, the use of red and yellow pigments for body decoration or artistic purposes, appears simultaneously across multiple regions, suggesting rapid cultural exchange during favourable climate periods. But perhaps the most significant thing spreading along these migration corridors was something less tangible. Social innovations, ways of organising communities, systems for managing resources and resolving conflicts, marriage practices that maintained relationships between distant groups, ritual behaviours that reinforced group identity and cooperation. These social technologies don't fossilize, they don't leave behind clear archaeological markers, but their effects are visible in the demographic patterns. During Green Sahara periods, human population densities across North Africa and the Middle East increased dramatically. Not just because more people could survive in the improved climate, but because they could organize themselves more effectively. They could maintain larger social networks. They could support specialized roles within communities. They could accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations more efficiently. When populations finally left Africa for good, they weren't just carrying genes and tools. They were carrying entire social systems that had been refined over hundreds of thousands of years of cycling through the Sahara Pump. Systems that had been tested repeatedly under the most demanding conditions. Success during green periods, survival during arid periods, recovery when the rains returned. This is why modern humans were so successful when they encountered other human species outside Africa. It wasn't just about having better tools or bigger brains. It was about having social systems that could scale up quickly when resources were abundant and contract efficiently when times were hard. Systems that could maintain cooperation across large territories. Systems that could integrate outsiders when useful and exclude them when necessary. The Neanderthals, who had evolved in the relatively stable environments of Ice Age Europe, didn't have these adaptive social technologies. They had their own social systems, certainly, but ones optimized for different challenges. When modern humans arrived in Europe, equipped with social and technological innovations refined by the Sahara Pump, they outcompeted Neanderthals not through violence, though there was some of that, but through sheer organizational efficiency. The same pattern played out in Asia with the Denisovans. Modern humans, carrying their Sahara-refined adaptive toolkit, could organize themselves more flexibly, exploit resources more efficiently, and maintain larger social networks than the established populations. Generation by generation, they expanded while the others contracted. But modern humans didn't just replace these other species, they absorbed them. The genetic evidence for interbreeding between modern humans and both Neanderthals and Denisovans tells us that when populations met, they sometimes chose cooperation over competition. Children born from these unions carried genetic contributions from both populations, and some of those genetic contributions are still with us today. That 2% Neanderthal DNA in non-African populations. Some of it is functional, genes that help process certain foods, genes that affect immune function, genes that influence skin pigmentation. When modern humans moved into Europe and encountered Neanderthals who'd been adapting to European environments for hundreds of thousands of years, interbreeding gave modern humans instant access to genetic adaptations that would have taken millennia to evolve from scratch. The same thing happened with Denisovans in Asia. Modern Tibetan populations carry Denisovan gene variants that help them survive at high altitudes. These genes are so perfectly adapted to high-altitude life that natural selection has maintained them at high frequencies for tens of thousands of years. Modern humans didn't have to slowly evolve these adaptations. They got them through interbreeding with Denisovans who already had them. This is the real legacy of the Sahara Pump. It didn't just push people around the world. It created a pattern of expansion, contraction, and re-expansion that refined human adaptability to an extraordinary degree. Every cycle selected for flexibility, cooperation, and innovation. Every green period allowed successful populations to expand. Every arid period eliminated groups that couldn't adapt. Every return to green conditions gave survivors a chance to try again with new knowledge and new strategies. By the time modern humans finally left Africa in their successful expansion around 60,000 years ago, they weren't just another population of primates trying their luck in new territories. They were the products of hundreds of thousands of years of climate-driven selection. They were adapted not to any specific environment, but to change itself, to unpredictability, to having to figure out new solutions to new problems repeatedly. And once they left Africa, they didn't stop moving. The same impulse that had driven them to follow the waters through the Green Sahara drove them across Eurasia. Within 15,000 years, they had reached Australia, requiring sophisticated boat-building skills and navigational knowledge. Within 20,000 years, they had spread across all of Asia and Europe. Within 30,000 years, they had crossed into the Americas. Every one of these expansions followed the same pattern, established by the Sahara Pump. Follow the water, exploit new resources, establish populations in favorable locations, maintain networks between groups, adapt technologies and social systems to local conditions. When resources become scarce, either innovate or move. We're still following this pattern today. Modern human migration, whether it's rural to urban movement, immigration between countries, or even our dreams of colonizing Mars, it's all driven by the same impulses that pushed our ancestors through the Green Sahara. The search for better opportunities, the desire to explore new territories, the drive to escape deteriorating conditions and find something better. Every person alive today carries the genetic signature of these ancient migrations. The variations in our DNA, the differences between populations, they're all echoes of those journeys through the Green Sahara and beyond. We're all descendants of people who looked at an impossible desert and decided to cross it anyway when the rains came, all products of the pump that made us human. So let's talk about what it was actually like to live in the Green Sahara, because this wasn't just empty grassland with occasional rain. This was a functioning ecosystem that supported human populations at densities we typically associate with agricultural societies, not hunter-gatherers. And the people living there weren't primitive nomads scratching out bare survival. They were creating complex cultures, developing sophisticated technologies, and laying the groundwork for some of the greatest civilizations in human history. Picture a morning in the Green Sahara, maybe 8,000 years ago. You wake up in a structure made of wooden poles and animal skins, or maybe one of the more permanent stone and mud brick dwellings that archaeologists have found at several sites. The air is cool before dawn, but you know the day will be warm, not the killing heat of the modern Sahara, but the pleasant warmth of a savanna morning. You can hear the lake, because there's always a lake nearby. The Green Sahara wasn't just wetter than the desert today, it was absolutely saturated with water. Paleoclimatologists estimate there were hundreds of permanent lakes scattered across what is now barren sand. Lake Megachad at its height was larger than the Caspian Sea. Other lakes, some as large as Lake Erie, dotted the landscape from Mauritania to Sudan. And these weren't just sources of drinking water, they were complete aquatic ecosystems teeming with fish. Nile perch, tilapia, catfish, all thriving in waters that were regularly replenished by monsoon rains. Archaeological sites from this period are absolutely packed with fish bones. Not occasional catches, but evidence of systematic daily fishing that provided a reliable protein source year-round. Your people have fishing technology that would impress many modern hunter-gatherers. Bone harpoons with carefully carved barbs, designed for specific fish species, nets woven from plant fibers, preserved in a few rare archaeological contexts, fish traps made from woven reeds, set in shallow waters to catch fish during seasonal migrations, stone weights for fishing lines, allowing you to fish in deeper waters where the largest perch congregate. But fishing is just the beginning. After a breakfast of smoked fish, you might join a hunting party heading into the grasslands. Because the Green Sahara wasn't just lakes and rivers, it was vast expanses of grassland and savanna that supported animal populations that would rival the Serengeti today. The rock art from this period gives us a window into what the hunters saw. Elephants, not the small forest elephants of modern Central Africa, but huge savanna elephants that stood over 12 feet tall, giraffes with coat patterns slightly different from their modern descendants, rhinoceros, hippos wallowing in every major water source, massive herds of antelope, buffalo, and other grazing animals that archaeologists are still trying to identify from their artistic representations, and your people were hunting them systematically, not as desperate scavengers, but as skilled predators with sophisticated weapons and tactics. The stone tool assemblages from Green Sahara sites show specialized hunting technology, carefully crafted spear points, including some of the earliest evidence for bow and arrow technology in Africa, throwing stones with exactly the right weight and balance for bringing down birds, cutting tools specifically designed for butchering large game animals. But here's what makes this really interesting. The hunting wasn't random. Archaeological analysis of animal bones from Green Sahara sites shows selective hunting patterns. Certain species were targeted at certain ages, suggesting an understanding of population management. Young adult males taken more frequently than breeding females, allowing game populations to remain stable even under hunting pressure. This is conservation biology before anyone had a word for conservation. Your ancestors in the Green Sahara had figured out that if you want to keep hunting in the same territory year after year, you can't just kill everything that moves. You have to think about tomorrow, next season, next generation. And they weren't just hunting and fishing. The plant resources in the Green Sahara were incredible. Archaeological botanists have identified remains of wild grains, fruits, nuts, and tubers from dozens of sites. Evidence of systematic plant processing is everywhere. Grinding stones for processing wild grains into flour, storage pits for preserving surplus plant foods, specialized tools for digging tubers from deep in the soil. Some researchers think the Green Sahara might have been where African agriculture began. Not full domestication yet, but something approaching it. Systematic harvesting of wild grains, probably replanting in favorable locations, protecting productive plants from grazing animals. The transition from wild plant exploitation to actual cultivation is gradual and hard to trace in the archaeological record, but all the pieces were falling into place. Most importantly, the Green Sahara was where African pastoralism was born, and this is one of the most significant technological and cultural developments in human history. Sometime around 8,000 years ago, people in the Green Sahara began systematically herding cattle, sheep, and goats. The rock art documenting this transition is spectacular. Early paintings show wild animals, hunting scenes, and fishing activities. Then, around 8,000 years ago, domestic cattle start appearing, not occasionally, but in massive herds. Some rock art sites show hundreds of cattle in a single scene, suggesting the artists were depicting real herd sizes they witnessed or managed. This wasn't just keeping a few tame animals around camp. This was systematic pastoralism on a massive scale. People were managing herds of hundreds of cattle, moving them between grazing areas seasonally, protecting them from predators, using them for milk, blood, and eventually meat. The cattle bones from archaeological sites show these animals were morphologically distinct from their wild ancestors. Domestication was happening, and it was happening fast. But cattle weren't just food, they were wealth, status, identity. The rock art makes this clear. Cattle are depicted with elaborate decorations, painted in colours that probably represented real markings and adornments. Human figures are shown in poses that suggest cattle ownership conferred prestige. Some of the most detailed artwork shows cattle with what look like ceremonial decorations, suggesting these animals had spiritual and cultural significance beyond mere nutrition. This is the beginning of what would become the great pastoral traditions of Africa. The Maasai, the Nuer, the Fulani, all these cattle-herding cultures that still exist today have their roots in the Green Sahara. When the desert returned, the herders didn't disappear. They moved following the grasslands south and east, carrying their pastoral traditions into the African interior. And with pastoralism came social complexity that would have been impossible for hunter-gatherers. Because here's the thing about cattle, they're mobile wealth. You can accumulate them, trade them, use them to establish alliances and social obligations. A hunter can only eat so much meat before it spoils, but a herder can own hundreds of cattle, building wealth that persists across generations. The archaeological evidence shows this increasing complexity everywhere you look. Trade networks that moved goods across hundreds of miles. Obsidian from volcanic sources in the Ethiopian highlands showing up at sites in the central Sahara, over 1,500 miles away. Shells from the Mediterranean and Red Sea coasts found deep in the interior. Distinctive pottery styles spreading across vast regions, suggesting cultural connections and probably intermarriage between distant groups. Pottery itself is one of the signature technologies of Green Sahara cultures, and we're not talking about crude, hand-formed pots. These are sophisticated ceramics with elaborate decorations. Wavy line pottery, named for its distinctive impressed patterns, is found across the entire Green Sahara region. The technical skill required to create these vessels, firing them at precise temperatures without cracking, decorating them while the clay is at exactly the right moisture content. This suggests specialized potters, people who devoted significant time to mastering a single craft. That specialization is the hallmark of complex societies. When you can support people who don't directly produce food, who instead make pottery or tools or maintain trade connections, you've moved beyond basic subsistence. You're creating civilization. The architectural remains support this picture of increasing social complexity. At sites like Gobero in Niger, archaeologists have found evidence of substantial structures. Not temporary camps, but permanent or semi-permanent settlements with stone foundations, organized layouts, clearly defined activity areas, specialized areas for tool production, separate from living spaces, areas that appear to be communal gathering spaces, suggesting social activities that brought multiple families together. And then there are the burials. The Green Sahara burial sites are some of the most informative and moving archaeological discoveries anywhere in Africa. At Gobero, archaeologists found nearly 200 burials spanning thousands of years. These weren't just bodies tossed in holes. They were carefully positioned, often accompanied by grave goods that tell us about the lives and values of Green Sahara peoples. Some burials contain pottery, stone tools, jewellery made from shells and stones. Others show evidence of elaborate ritual. At one site, archaeologists found a woman and 2 children buried together, positioned so they appear to be holding hands. The care taken in this burial, the emotional weight of that positioning, tells us these people experienced loss and love just like we do. They created meaning around death, developed rituals to process grief and honor the dead. Other burials contain artistic objects that suggest spiritual beliefs. Small carved stones with geometric patterns. ochre pigments that might have been used for body decoration or ritual purposes. In some cases, animal bones buried alongside humans, possibly representing sacrifice or symbolic relationships between people and specific animal species. The rock art itself provides our most direct window into Green Sahara spiritual and cultural life. And we're not talking about a few crude drawings. There are thousands of rock art sites scattered across the Sahara, containing tens of thousands of individual images. Some sites have panels covering hundreds of square meters depicting elaborate scenes with dozens of human and animal figures. The earliest rock art, from around 12,000 years ago when the Sahara was just beginning to green, shows large wild animals. The artists focused on the megafauna, the spectacular animals that dominated the landscape. The style is naturalistic, showing anatomical details that demonstrate close observation. These weren't symbolic or abstract representations. They were portraits of specific animals, probably drawn by people who knew their subjects intimately through hunting. Later, around 10,000 years ago, the style shifts. The art becomes more stylized, more symbolic. Human figures appear more frequently, often shown engaged in activities. Hunting scenes with elaborate choreography, suggesting these might be depicting real hunting strategies or perhaps ritual dances meant to ensure hunting success. Figures with raised arms, possibly in prayer or celebration. Scenes that might represent trance states or spiritual experiences. Then, as pastoralism developed, cattle dominate the imagery. Some rock art sites are almost entirely devoted to cattle. Massive panels showing hundreds of animals, often with careful attention to individual markings and characteristics. The famous cattle period rock art of the Sahara represents one of the most extensive artistic traditions in prehistoric Africa. But the art isn't just depicting daily life. It's creating meaning, establishing identity, communicating values. The choice of which animals to depict, which activities to show, these are cultural decisions that tell us what mattered to Green Sahara peoples. The care taken in creating these images, some of which required scaffolding to reach high rock faces, demonstrates that art itself was valued, that creating these images served important social or spiritual functions. Some researchers think the rock art sites were territorial markers, ways of claiming ownership over particularly valuable resources. Others suggest they were teaching tools, ways of transmitting knowledge about animals, hunting techniques or spiritual practices. Still others think they were religious sites, places where people gathered for ceremonies and rituals that reinforced community bonds. Probably they were all of these things. The Sahara was greening for over 5,000 years. That's enough time for rock art traditions to evolve, for different sites to take on different meanings, for cultural practices to change and develop. The rock art we see today represents thousands of individual decisions by hundreds of generations of artists, each adding their voice to an ongoing conversation about what it meant to be human in the Green Sahara. And all of this abundance, this cultural and technological flowering, was creating something unprecedented in African prehistory. Population densities in the Green Sahara reached levels that wouldn't be seen again until the development of full agriculture. Some estimates suggest tens of thousands of people living in what is now the most desolate desert on Earth. These weren't isolated bands of wanderers. They were interconnected communities with regular contact, shared cultural practices, probably complex kinship systems that regulated marriage and alliance across vast territories. They were, in every meaningful sense, creating civilization. And when the Sahara began drying again, around 5,500 years ago, these people didn't just disappear. They moved. The archaeological and genetic evidence shows clear migrations out of the Sahara into surrounding regions. Some went north to the Mediterranean coast. Others went south into the Sahel and the West African interior. Many went east toward the Nile Valley, and they carried their technologies, their cultural practices, their domestic animals with them. The pastoral traditions of East Africa, the early agricultural communities of West Africa, and most spectacularly, the civilization of ancient Egypt, all have roots in the Green Sahara. Because here's the thing about the Nile Valley before Egypt. It was relatively marginal territory, a narrow ribbon of fertility in an otherwise harsh landscape. But as the Sahara dried, refugees from the desert brought cattle, sophisticated tool technologies, pottery traditions, and organizational knowledge accumulated over thousands of years of life in the Green Sahara. Within a few centuries of the Sahara's final drying, Egypt had gone from scattered agricultural villages to one of the most complex civilizations in human history. That's not coincidence. That's the legacy of the Green Sahara, concentrated and refined in the one place where water remained reliable. The pump had shut off, but the people it had nurtured carried its gifts into the future. But here's the thing about the Sahara Pump. It's not broken. It's just switched off. Temporarily. Because those same orbital cycles that turned the Sahara green 5 times before, they're still running. The Earth is still wobbling on its axis. Our orbit around the Sun is still shifting between more circular and more elliptical. The precession that determines which hemisphere gets more intense summers is still cycling through its 23,000-year rhythm. And according to the math, according to the orbital mechanics that have been driving climate for millions of years, the Sahara should green again. In about 15,000 years, give or take a few millennia, the conditions should align perfectly. The African monsoons should strengthen, the rains should return, and the world's largest desert should transform back into the savanna and wetland paradise that pumped humanity across the globe. Should, that's the critical word, because there's a wild card in the system now that's never existed before. Us. Human civilization has dumped so much carbon into the atmosphere that we've fundamentally altered the climate system. We've essentially jammed our fingers into the gears of the natural cycles that have been running smoothly for millions of years. And nobody knows exactly what that means for the next Green Sahara. Some climate models suggest we've actually delayed the greening by thousands of years. The greenhouse gases we've released are warming the planet in ways that might disrupt the normal monsoon patterns. The delicate balance between solar radiation, ocean temperatures, and atmospheric circulation that triggers the Sahara Pump could be thrown completely out of whack. Other models suggest something even stranger, that we might accelerate the greening, or trigger a partial greening that happens in fits and starts rather than the smooth transitions of the past. Or we might create entirely new climate patterns that have no precedent in the geological record. Think about that for a second. For 300,000 years, the Sahara Pump has been the most predictable, most reliable climate cycle affecting human populations. Our ancestors could literally set their calendars by it. Every 20,000 something years, the desert turns green. Every few thousand years after that, it dries out again, as regular as clockwork. Except now the clockwork might be broken, and we broke it. Without even knowing the clock existed until about 30 years ago. This isn't just academic speculation. Scientists are actively studying this question right now. Research teams are drilling deep into Saharan lake beds, extracting sediment cores that record hundreds of thousands of years of climate history. They're analysing ancient pollen trapped in rock layers, reconstructing exactly what plants grew where and when. They're using satellite imagery to map ancient river systems buried under hundreds of feet of sand. One of the most ambitious projects is based in Chad, where researchers are studying the sediments of ancient Lake Mega-Chad. During the last Green Sahara, this lake was larger than the Caspian Sea is today. It was bigger than all the Great Lakes combined. Now it's about the size of Los Angeles and shrinking every year. The sediment cores from the lake bed contain a complete record of every Green Sahara period for the last 1,000,000 years. Layer by layer, you can see the transition from desert to paradise and back again. You can identify the exact years when the rains came and when they stopped. You can track the arrival and departure of animal species. You can even find pollen from plants that only grow in specific rainfall conditions, giving you precise measurements of ancient precipitation levels. What this research is showing us is terrifying and fascinating in equal measure. The transitions between green and dry weren't always gradual. Sometimes they happened shockingly fast. There's evidence that during some cycles the Sahara went from functional desert to lush grassland in less than 200 years. A single human lifetime could witness the transformation, but here's what keeps the climate scientists up at night. There's also evidence that the system has tipping points. Once certain thresholds are crossed, the changes become self-reinforcing and extremely difficult to reverse. During Green Sahara periods, the vegetation itself helped maintain the rainfall. Plants transpire water vapor into the atmosphere, which forms clouds, which produces more rain, which supports more plants. It's a positive feedback loop. Once it gets going, it's stable, but it works in reverse too. Once enough vegetation dies off, there's less water vapor, fewer clouds, less rain, more plant death. The desert feeds itself. The worry is that human-caused climate change might push the Sahara past a tipping point into a state that resists the natural greening cycle, or conversely, that we might accidentally trigger a premature greening that happens too fast for ecosystems and human societies to adapt. Some researchers think we're already seeing the beginning of changes. Satellite imagery from the last 30 years shows the southern boundary of the Sahara has been shifting. Not consistently, it moves north some years and south others, but the average trend shows slight greening in some regions. Is this the beginning of the next Green Sahara, arriving 15,000 years early? Or is it just normal climate variability? Nobody knows for sure. But let's imagine for a moment that it did happen. That somehow, whether through natural cycles or human influence or some combination, the Sahara greened today. Over the next few centuries, the largest desert on Earth transformed into habitable land. The implications would be absolutely staggering. We're talking about adding 3.5 million square miles of arable land to a planet that's rapidly running out of places to grow food. That's an area larger than Australia. Imagine the agricultural potential. The Sahara sits right in the middle of some of the most densely populated regions on Earth. North Africa, the Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, all facing water scarcity, desertification, food security challenges. A Green Sahara would be like turning on a tap that's been closed for 5,000 years. Current estimates suggest a fully green Sahara could support somewhere between 100 million to 500 million people, depending on how you calculate carrying capacity. That's not just room for population growth. That's enough surplus agricultural production to feed a significant fraction of Earth's current population. The geopolitical implications would be enormous. Nations that currently have vast stretches of empty desert would suddenly control some of the most valuable real estate on the planet. Egypt, Libya, Chad, Niger, Mali, Mauritania, All of these countries would be transformed overnight from resource poor to resource rich. You'd see massive population movements, not refugees fleeing disaster, but economic migrants moving toward opportunity. Cities would spring up in regions that have been uninhabited for 5 millennia. Ancient river valleys that supported the first Saharan civilizations would bloom with life again. And here's where it gets really interesting. Some people aren't waiting for nature to do it. There are serious proposals right now to deliberately green portions of the Sahara through massive engineering projects. The most ambitious is called the Sahara Forest Project. The concept is to use seawater greenhouses and renewable energy to create artificial oases that would gradually expand into the surrounding desert. You pump seawater inland, use solar power to desalinate it, grow crops in specialized greenhouses, and use the excess vegetation to start changing the local climate. The idea is that once you get enough vegetation established, it creates its own microclimate. The plants transpire water, humidity increases, local rainfall patterns begin to change. Eventually, you reach a tipping point where the system becomes self-sustaining. Pilot projects have already been built in Jordan and Qatar. They work, at least on a small scale. Crops grow in the middle of the desert using seawater and sunlight. The question is whether the concept can scale up to the size needed to actually transform regional climates. Other proposals are even more ambitious. There are scientists seriously discussing pumping water from the Congo River basin into central Saharan depressions, creating massive artificial lakes that would alter continental weather patterns, or building enormous solar farms that would change the desert's albedo, its reflectivity, which would affect local temperatures and wind patterns, potentially triggering increased rainfall. These aren't fringe ideas from crazy engineers. These are peer-reviewed proposals published in serious scientific journals, discussed at climate conferences. Because the climate crisis is forcing us to think about interventions that would have seemed like science fiction 30 years ago. But they raise enormous questions. Who decides whether to green the Sahara? What about the species that have adapted to desert conditions over the last 5,000 years? What if we trigger changes that cascade in unexpected ways? What if we're successful and then can't maintain the systems we've built? The ghost of the last Green Sahara haunts these discussions, because we know what happened when a thriving populous Sahara dried out. We've seen the archaeological evidence, collapsed civilizations, mass migrations, warfare over dwindling resources, the Bronze Age collapse that nearly ended Mediterranean civilization. If we create a new Green Sahara through engineering rather than natural cycles, we'd better be damn sure we can maintain it. Because if those systems fail, if the pumps shut down or the governments collapse or the funding runs out, we'd be engineering a catastrophe. Hundreds of millions of people would be stranded in a desert that's reverting to its natural state. And that brings us back to the biggest lesson of the Sahara Pump. The lesson that's written in sediment layers and ancient lake beds and the genetic code of every human alive. Environments that seem stable, that seem permanent, can change with shocking speed. The Sahara has taught us that what looks like eternal desert can become paradise within a human lifetime, and that paradise can disappear just as quickly. Our ancestors lived through these transitions over and over. They adapted by staying mobile, by maintaining connections across vast distances, by developing technologies and social systems flexible enough to handle dramatic environmental change. Modern humans are doing the opposite. We've built civilizations that depend on climate stability. Our cities are permanent installations in specific locations. Our agriculture requires predictable rainfall patterns. Our political borders assume that habitable regions will stay habitable and uninhabitable regions will stay uninhabitable. But climate doesn't care about our assumptions. The Sahara Pump is just one of many natural cycles that can transform vast regions of the planet. There are monsoon systems in Asia that periodically fail. There are ice sheets that periodically collapse. There are ocean currents that periodically shift. And now we've added human-caused climate change on top of all these natural cycles. We're conducting a massive uncontrolled experiment on the only planet we've got. The climate refugee crisis we're seeing right now, people fleeing drought in the Sahel, sea level rise in Bangladesh, desertification in Central America, this is just the beginning. The UN estimates there could be 1 billion climate refugees by 2050. That's more people on the move than during any migration in human history, except it's not, actually, because we've forgotten our own history. 10,000 years ago, when the Sahara dried out for the last time, millions of people were displaced. Entire civilizations packed up and moved. The Bronze Age migrations involved millions more. The expansion out of Africa during Green Sahara periods moved entire populations across continents. We're a migratory species. We're descended from people who walked across an entire planet, adapting to every environment they encountered. Climate refugees aren't an aberration in human history. They're the norm. Settled civilization is the aberration. The difference is that our ancestors could move into empty territories. There were always frontiers, always new lands that could support human populations. Now the planet is full. Every habitable region is already claimed by somebody. Every resource is already being exploited. When the next great migration happens, and it's happening right now, there's nowhere empty to go. The climate refugees of the 21st century aren't facing empty continents. They're facing borders and walls and policies designed to keep them out. But here's what the Sahara Pump teaches us. Those walls won't hold. They never do. When environmental conditions become intolerable, people move. They moved when the Sahara dried out 5,000 years ago. They moved during the medieval climate anomaly. They moved during the Little Ice Age. They moved during every climate crisis in human history, and they always will. Because we're still carrying the genes and the cultural adaptations of those first survivors who walked out of the Green Sahara. We're still the descendants of migrants. The question isn't whether there will be mass migrations in response to climate change. The question is whether we'll manage those migrations humanely, whether we'll plan for them, prepare for them, or whether we'll resist the inevitable until the pressure becomes explosive. The Sahara Pump created the modern world. It scattered our ancestors across the globe, seeded the civilizations that would eventually become our own. It taught us that environmental change, even catastrophic environmental change, can be survived if we're willing to adapt. But survival isn't the same as thriving, and adaptation isn't free. Our ancestors paid a terrible price for every transition, every migration, every collapse and reformation of their societies. We have advantages they didn't. We understand the climate systems that drive these changes. We can model future scenarios. We can see the disasters coming decades before they arrive. We have technologies that would seem like magic to ancient peoples. But we also have vulnerabilities they didn't. Our food systems are globalized and fragile. Our cities are built on the assumption of stable coastlines and reliable water sources. Our political systems struggle to cooperate even when survival depends on it. The next Green Sahara is coming, maybe in 15,000 years according to the natural cycles, maybe sooner if human-caused climate change accelerates it, maybe never if we've broken the system beyond repair. But the lesson remains. The Sahara Pump isn't just ancient history. It's a preview of our future, because climate will continue to change, as it always has, driven by natural cycles we can't control and human influences we can barely understand. The question is whether we'll be as adaptable as our ancestors, whether we'll recognize the early warnings and act on them, whether we'll help each other through the transitions or fight over the diminishing resources. The descendants of the Green Sahara faced these choices 5,000 years ago. Some groups cooperated and survived. Others fought and disappeared. Some adapted and thrived. Others clung to dying territories until it was too late. We're facing the same choices now, on a larger scale, with more people, with higher stakes, but the same fundamental decisions our ancestors made beside drying Saharan lakes. And written in the dust of that ancient desert is the answer to whether humans can adapt to climate catastrophe. Because we already did, multiple times. The survivors are reading these words right now. So here we are. At the end of a story that spans hundreds of thousands of years, multiple human species, and a climate cycle that turned the world's largest desert into a garden and back again, repeatedly, for millennia. But here's the thing about the Sahara Pump. It wasn't just a mechanism that moved people around. It was a forge, a crucible that shaped everything about who we are as a species. Think about it. Every time the pump turned on and the Sahara bloomed green, it created opportunities, new territories to explore, new resources to exploit, new populations expanding into lands that had been empty desert just generations before. These were times of abundance, innovation, cultural flourishing. Times when human populations could grow, experiment with new technologies, develop complex social structures without the constant pressure of survival. Then the pump would reverse. The rains would fail, the grasslands would shrivel, the megafauna would disappear. And suddenly, those thriving populations face terrible choices: stay and die, or migrate into unknown territory where other groups might already be living. Move or perish. This cycle repeated over and over. Every 20,000 years or so for the past few million years, the African humid period would arrive, transform the Sahara, enable massive human expansions. Then it would end, force populations to contract, drive migrations outward in every direction. It was like a heartbeat, the pump's rhythm pulsing through human history, driving the story of our species forward. But it did more than just move us around. The pump selected for specific traits: adaptability. Because the climate could shift dramatically within a few generations, humans who could change strategies quickly had massive survival advantages. Cooperation. Because navigating migrations required group coordination, knowledge sharing, the ability to maintain social networks across vast distances. Innovation. Because new environments demanded new solutions, new tools, new ways of finding food and water and shelter. Every time the pump cycled, it weeded out populations that couldn't adapt and rewarded those that could. For hundreds of thousands of years, this selection pressure refined humanity like a craftsman refining a blade. We became the ultimate generalists, capable of surviving anywhere, eating anything, adapting to conditions that would kill almost any other large mammal. And the effects went global. Every continent outside Antarctica bears traces of migrations triggered by the Sahara Pump. The people who walked into Europe 45,000 years ago, who developed the sophisticated cultures that painted Lascaux Cave and carved Venus figurines, they were responding to climate shifts that began in North Africa. The populations that crossed into Asia and eventually reached Australia, They were following the pump's rhythm. The groups that made it to the Americas by 15,000 years ago, their ancestors' ancestors had been set in motion by the Sahara's transformation. We are all, every single one of us, products of the pump. Our capacity for language, our ability to create art, our drive to explore and innovate, even our physical features, darker skin in the tropics, lighter skin in northern regions. These are all adaptations that trace back, at least partially, to populations moving in response to the Sahara's climate cycles. Modern humans didn't just happen. We were made, shaped by millions of years of our planet's rhythms, refined by the greatest climate engine in human history. The Sahara Pump turned ancient hominins into us, into a species capable of surviving anywhere, thriving everywhere, eventually dominating the entire planet. And here's what really gets me. That same mechanism is still operating. The Sahara will turn green again someday, probably in about 15,000 years if the orbital patterns continue as predicted. The pump will activate once more, transform one of Earth's harshest environments into a landscape of rivers, grasslands, and forests. What will humanity be like then? Will we still be around to see it? Will we remember that our ancestors once lived there, thrived there, were shaped there into the species that conquered the world? We're creatures of deep time, products of cycles so long that individual human lives barely register as blips. But we're also the only species that can understand those cycles, trace them backward, imagine them forward. We can look at the desert today and see the garden it once was. We can read climate data and understand the pump that made us. That's our gift and our burden. The awareness of how small we are in time, how contingent our existence, and yet how resilient, how adaptable, how incredibly successful we've been. Against odds that should have destroyed us 1,000,000 times over. So if you've made it this far, if this story of deep time and climate cycles and ancient migrations has resonated with you, do me a favor, hit that like button. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from, because we're all part of this story, all descendants of those pump-driven migrations. And subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this to tell. Human history stretching back millions of years waiting to be explored. Tonight, go outside if you can. Look up at the stars. The same stars that guided ancient migrants across a Green Sahara shine on the desert today. The same constellations that hunters tracked across grasslands now filled with sand. The cosmos hasn't changed, but the earth beneath it transforms constantly, rhythmically, following patterns older than our species. And we're still here. Still adapting, still moving, still shaped by the pump that made us human.